Hello. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. I did wait just a moment because I love when people say it back. So I'll say it again in case anybody didn't hear me in the back. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. I like the energy. Thank you. Welcome to our annual clinical lecture. Our lecture is entitled Race and Social Work Practice, the Challenges of Working with and Across Populations. I'm Dr. Erica Lewis. I'm an assistant professor here at the School of Social Work, as well as a member of our clinical committee. We also have Dr. Melissa Smith, who will introduce our wonderful speaker today, Dr. Kenneth Hardy. So before we begin, we have a few announcements. The first is that Dr. Hardy is so popular that we needed to have an extra room, so we have an overflow room, if you will. It's upstairs, and it's being live streamed there. And so we will have a question and answer section at the end of the talk. And so those who are in the overflow room, if you will look for a woman named Elizabeth. So Elizabeth, if you'll wave to the folks in the room, she will take your questions, she'll bring them down, and we will give them to Dr. Hardy. We'll also be having a chat and chew this afternoon, which is going to be at, God bless you. We'll be at 5 o'clock in room 2W11. And so this just gives us, bless you, an opportunity to talk about the lecture and the different topics that are going to be discussed today. If you're thinking about the Shady Grove campus, there will be a chat and chew on Wednesday at 5 p.m. So before I hand it over to Dr. Smith to introduce our speaker, we thought it would be important to just share a few words about Dr. Hardy's role in our careers and how his work has touched our careers, both as educators and clinicians. So when thinking of Dr. Hardy's work and the videos, the many videos that I've watched, the books that I've read, and the skills that I've learned, it's really helped me become more comfortable talking about race, especially when thinking about my work with clients. I know that sometimes it can be an often difficult conversation to have, but very needed, especially when thinking about where our clients are and the space that they take in this world. Dr. Hardy has a multicultural perspective that just requires us to have to use this multicultural approach in order to really meet the needs of our clients. He also has given me lots of skills that I've been able to also take into the classroom so that I can talk about race. So my students know that it's important to me and it should be important to them as they're working with their clients. And I'm sure my students are here and they'll tell you that we do not shy away from this conversation. So now without further ado, I will hand it over to Dr. Smith.
Thank you, Dr. Lewis. First of all, good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Okay, let's try that again like Dr. Lewis did. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. All right, great. I'm honored to be able to introduce Dr. Kenneth Hardy as our fall clinical lecturer. Just to tell you a little bit about his career and the impact he's had. Dr. Hardy is a professor at Drexel University in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and is the director of the Eikenbereg Institute for Relationships in New York City, where he maintains a private practice specializing in working with traumatized and oppressed populations. Dr. Hardy is the former director of the Center for Children, Families, and Trauma at the Eikenbereg Institute in New York City, and formerly served on the faculty at Syracuse University. He is the recipient of several awards, including the International Association for Marriage and Family Counselors Distinguished Contribution to Marriage and Family Counseling Award and the Distinguished Contributions Award to Family Therapy and Social Justice of the American Family Therapy Academy. He's internationally recognized as a clinician, author, educator, and trainer, and has authored numerous articles and books. Most recently, Dr. Hardy co-authored the book Promoting Culturally Sensitive Supervision, a manual for practitioners, as well as published The Self of the Therapist in Epistemological Context, a multicultural relational perspective in the Journal of Family and Psychotherapy. Dr. Hardy has been a frequent contributor to popular media and has been featured on The Oprah Winfrey Show, Dateline NBC, 2020, and the Discovery Health Channel. He's also featured in several therapy videos, as well as his own video, The Psychological Residuals of Slavery, that serves as a catalyst for discussion and a tool for beginning to move forward toward a more promising future for honestly confronting these deeply significant and painful aspects of our collective past. Dr. Hardy has received considerable acclaim for the contributions he has made toward challenging the field to think critically about issues of diversity, trauma, and oppression. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Kenneth Hardy.
So, good afternoon. You don't have to bother to say get back, because I know it's getting old by now, so we'll just make it one way here. I did want to take a moment just to say I'm absolutely just thrilled to be here, and I actually had the opportunity to come here, I don't know how long ago, but maybe 10 years ago, and it was a fascinating experience. But I'm particularly delighted today because this topic area is one that is near and dear to my own heart, and as I was saying to some folks this morning before getting started, and it certainly is very timely, just from my perspective, just given the current political climate in which we all operate. So I'm actually thrilled to have this opportunity, and what I plan to do is to talk for about 45 minutes and then leave ample time for conversation, exchange of ideas, because I wanted to warn you here that I'm actually going to talk about the world akin to Ken Hardy, and just want you to know that I know that's precisely what I'm doing. So there are no inherent you shoulds in anything I say. So if in fact you have a set of well-cultivated ideas with which you're in a long-term monogamous relationship with, that you can stay in your monogamous relationship with your ideas. But I'm going to talk rather liberally about what I think, and keep in mind that it's just, through my vantage point, and part of the reason having 45 minutes is to have some cross-fertilization of ideas. And quite frankly, if you have ideas or thoughts that are fundamentally different from what I've shared, that there's an opportunity to share those. And I feel very strongly about this because I think that when it comes to matters of race, that just for me personally, I'm absolutely just totally fatigued with the ways in which we struggle to talk about it. And it seems like it's very difficult to have meaningful, progressive conversations about race in any context. And I'm at a place of destitution in my life that I'm so desperate to have these conversations that I'm willing to suspend all sorts of ground rules for it. So my thing is, you don't have to be polite with me. You don't have to sort of choose your words carefully. Just give it to me straight with no chaser, and I'd appreciate that. So what I want to do, I want to take this first segment of the day and to sort of, in a rather truncated way, talk about some assumptions that I make about race that I think have broad sweeping implications for not just the profession of social work, but for our lives as well. And I'll move through these very quickly, and then if there are questions you have in the Q&A, you can certainly hold me accountable to this. But part of it that I believe that in order to position ourselves to have conversations about race, I think that it requires us to walk through sort of three interrelated processes, and that is seeing, being, and doing. And that particularly like in social work and in helping professions, when we are serious about taking race on, and it's understandable that we almost immediately want to start with the doing phase of it, and it makes sense to me. It makes sense that we'd want to do that. But I think that attempting to do the doing is premature if we haven't done the seeing and the being. And the seeing is about how do we begin to see the world through the prism of race. Because I think in some ways they're the blatant displays of race, but much of what happens racially happens much more subtly. And that one's eyes have to be trained in order to see the subtleties and the intricacies of race. And I think in the helping professions, and particularly in social work, that we're trained to see what we look for. And so if we tend not to look for race, we tend not to see it. In much the same way, if we're trained to look for pathology, we see it. If, on the other hand, we're trained to look for the pearls of functionality that are embedded in the web of dysfunctionality, that we're able to see that as well. So I think our eyes have to be trained to sort of see race in all the ways in which it manifests itself. And then once we begin to see it, then we have to sort of struggle and grapple with the being. And the being is sort of about our existential selves. And what does this mean for me now that I began to see the world through this prism in a way that I haven't seen it before? And what I really believe is that once my eyes have been sharpened to see even the most intricate manifestations of race, it has propelled me to want to go back and actually change the lyrics to Amazing Grace, to change it to, I was once blind, but now I see. And oh my gosh, seeing is not all it's cracked up to be. Because once you begin to train your eyes to see the intricacies of race, that you can no longer not see it. I can't tell you the number of premature dates I've been on, dates that I've ruined because of my inability to not see race now. I can no longer enjoy a movie just for entertainment purposes without being tuned into the ways in which the pimps and the thugs are always black and brown people. And the smart, all-knowing superheroes continue in 2018 to still be white. And when I see it, then I cannot not comment on it. And so there's a way in which there's a sense of agitation that we live with once we begin to sharpen our visual acuity and be able to tune into race. And that once we see and we have that sense of agitation, it almost propels us then to be able to do something about it. That it creates a kind of angst for us when we don't. And I do believe there's a kind of dissonance oftentimes that we have. And so I did want to say then, just in terms of some of these assumptions. So the first is that walking through this place of seeing, being, and doing. The second is just recognizing that race is a powerful organizing principle in our lives, that there are no interactions that, in my estimation, aren't shaped by the nuances of race. And so I'd like to dispel this notion that we need people of color present in order for a situation to be racial. Even when people of color aren't present, it's racial. And I've had this affirmed for me very recently when in our program, I'm behind the mirror doing we have our master's and doctoral students do therapy, and supervisors are always behind the mirror. I'm behind the mirror, and there's a white clinician who's working with a white family. And she's, that sort of petite cocktail moment we have in therapy where we check in with folks, where we talk about the weather and the traffic, before we get started with the real work. And so this particular therapist, Rebecca, so she asked, I'm behind the mirror, and behind the mirror with me are two women of color, one Latina, one African American, and a white, all doctoral students. And so Rebecca starts out the session by asking the family, so how are you doing today? And all the mother answered right away, the two adolescent children answered, and the father remained silent. And so Rebecca noticed that, and so she decided to pursue him. So she asked, so Mr. Peterson, how are you? And I'm sure she regrets that moment to this day. So Mr. Peterson said, my day, and he was already agitated. I mean, he said, I had a GD terrible day. He said, I got up. It's a damn shame when you get up 3 hours before work, you end up an hour late for work, but I got my damn car wouldn't start. And so I show up for work, hour late, work all day, and then I had to take the damn bus home. And you know who takes the GED bus. You know who's on the bus. It was animated. He said, I'm on the bus with a bunch of, and he said N-word, and then the S-word for Latinos. That's my day. I'm on the bus with a bunch of N's and S's, and so that Rebecca, at this point, she knows I'm behind the mirror. So she's doing this. But there's something about this vignette that just points out just the whole dynamics of race in our society, because behind the mirror was an interesting set of interactions as well. So unbeknownst to me, I still don't know why, perhaps nervousness, the white student began almost instantly to apologize profusely to me. Oh, Ken, I'm so sorry. I really apologize. And so I'm not sure why she's apologizing to me. So I'm thinking, are you thinking of me as the N-word? Or like, why are you apologizing? And so that was, and I think it was just her nervousness about it. And then the two trainees of color were saying to me, so, like, what are you waiting for? Like, what are you going to do? And so I'm actually waiting to see what's going to happen in the room, what happens next. I mean, and they were getting increasingly agitated with me. And so in the room, that process was totally paralyzed because it was familiar to me where this issue of race comes up in a working relationship. And I'm sure that it insulted all the sensibilities of Rebecca, the therapist. But she didn't know what to say. She didn't know how to respond. So she didn't say anything, which then makes her, in my estimation, complicit with it. So behind the mirror, I couldn't actually feel the sense of agitation right away because there was a part of me that was actually extolling the fact that I just heard this mean-spirited display of racial epithets. And so I had this momentary sense of glee and euphoria, which is inexplicable. It wasn't because I was happy that he used these terminology or these terms, but I was happy because I finally got a chance to see it live in living color. Because there's a way in which when we're in cross-racial situations, we're always so incredibly polite about the language we use. And here it was in the apex of its ugliness there in front of me. And so for that moment, I was too self-absorbed to be offended because I was full of like this sort of hard to explain happiness that I actually experienced because I was saying, like, maybe I'm not crazy after all, or if I am crazy, maybe I'm crazy for a whole different set of reasons. But because when I watch cross-racial interaction, when I participate in it, that there's always this element of politeness, and so I grew up in a family where my parents, who both born in the South, would remind me about all the things that I might be called in my life and trying to prepare me for the ruggedness of the world out there. But it's been rare in my life that I've actually been faced. And so once I got over that, I did get over that, I had this moment of passive aggression, I must admit to you, because I thought, maybe they're right, because they were threatening to go in the room, and I didn't think that was a good option. I didn't think that could have a positive outcome if they went in the room. But then I started thinking, well, maybe I will go in the room. And I'll go in and I'll knock on the door and I'll say, Mr. Peterson, I was behind the mirror, and I heard, sir, that you're having a terrible day. And I just want to let you know your terrible day just got worse, actually, because I'm the supervisor here. And I recognize that was just my moment of passive aggression. I didn't do that, but it was a nice thought. And so the real critical part was then getting Jessica to lean into those conversations. And so I have a colleague of mine that we're on ongoing debates about how to handle these matters when they come up clinically. And so, and I'm not suggesting there's a right way or wrong way, but we just have different views about it. So my colleague, who's an African-American woman, takes the approach that she says to clients, we don't talk this way in therapy, and basically she issues a kind of cease and desist. That always seems rather bizarre to me because that we don't talk that way usually follows after you've just talked that way. So, and I quite frankly don't agree with that approach, although it's a viable approach, because I think it's more the same. And I just think we need to be able to have meaningful conversations about race, even in the face of like its most blatant ugliness. And so I wanted Rebecca to lean into that conversation, which she did. And so I asked her to say to Mr. Peterson, I certainly have heard those terms before, and I have a construction about what they mean. I'm curious about what they mean to you. And so that keeps the dialogue going, because for me, we have to decide what is our intent. Is it to keep the dialogue going, or is it to shut it down? And I think we are now living with the ills of shutting down conversations about race. So for me, the imprint is for clinicians, for all of us, when we're confronted with those hard to engage comments about race, that we go to our place of curiosity, even in the face of offense, tremendous offense, and that we give ourselves the freedom to explore motivation or meaning. It's either motivation or meaning. What is the motivation for the use of those terms? What do you mean by those? And that once he said what he meant by them, which he didn't bite his tongue, Then he basically, for him, that the S word that he used, that's usually used for Puerto Ricans, he used it for all Latinx people. He didn't discriminate. And of course, the N word is always reserved for, black people, for the most part. So then the next question is that for the therapist to basically self-disclose and use of self and say that I think of those terms as really derogatory terms, almost despicable derogatory terms for people of color. And so it makes me think that somehow you've had, what has your experience been with African Americans and Latinos that would propel you to use such language? And then, of course, as usually is the case, that just in my experience, when white people have like a negative experience with a person of color, it usually leads to the indictment of all people of color. The reverse doesn't happen for white people. I mean, we see that on our watch every day because, like, we're living in a time where, like, 99.9% of the mass shooters are white people, white men. We never hear them described that way. We're lucky if we hear them described as men, but white men, never. And we don't walk around afraid of all white men, even when there's reason to be, in some ways. We saw this again with, I call the Rudy Giuliani principle, where Giuliani said during the latter years of the Obama presidency that Obama has screwed up so badly that we'll never have a black president. I actually think he's probably right about that. And because there's a different standard held for people of color in this society. Now, and again, we're going to open this up, so I don't assume that everybody has the same political stripe, but I have no qualms in exposing mine because I think we can't have meaningful conversations if we hide behind what we believe. So, I mean, from my vantage point, there are a plethora of reasons to have concerns about, like, the current president. But just entertain this for a moment. Do you think that we'll hear anybody says, Trump has screwed up so badly that we'll never have another white male president in our society? See, the mere notion is laughable because we know that will never happen. We know it will never happen. But there's a double standard. And it speaks to how powerful the role that race plays in our society. So I also want to say that another major point I want to get through at this point, because I think it has fertile underpinnings for the work we do and how we interact with each other, that I happen to be of the opinion that we all are racially socialized. Every single person in this room has been racially socialized. And yet, the manner in which we're racially socialized is racialized. So there's a difference in how we're racially socialized. So I think people of color are racially socialized and know that they are. So actually, when we talk, when families of color talk about the talk, we understand that the talk is explicitly a conversation about race. I actually think that if there are one or two people of color who actually grow up in families unaware of the fact they're people of color, life is going to be really hard for them. Because our society has a way, even if one is oblivious to one's race, our society has to remind you that you're a person of color. So I do think that for people of color, the socialization process happens overtly. I think for white people, it tends to happen, and I can't say every white person, but predominantly white people, most of white people, it happens more implicitly. And so I have colleagues who grew up in very white, progressive liberal families who'll say, I never heard my parents ever use a racial epithet. They never warned us about playing with kids of color. But I do have memories of like driving through Harlem and my dad saying, lock your doors. Or driving through Oakland and lock your doors. And so the messages were much more implicit rather than explicit. And another part of socialization is that, and again, I'm not suggesting that I'm not operating within the framework of what's good and what's bad, but rather what's different. So in many ways, when our contexts are different, our realities are different. So because the socialization process for people of color happens so overtly, that whenever I do workshops like this, I'll ask the question for people of color, roughly at what age did you begin to think about yourself racially? And for many people of color, that occurs somewhere around 3 or 4. It happens very early in life. And ask the same question of whites, and usually it's in college, in my MSW program, in my DSW program, in this workshop. It happens much later. And again, it's not a criticism, but to point out that how we share the same soil, but in many ways when it comes to race, we live in very different worlds. And when our contexts are different, our realities are different. So I understand why my white colleague at Drexel often says to me in faculty meetings, why is everything always about race for you, Ken? Always about race. And so I think it's always about race because I live in a society where race has been highlighted for me. I grew up with a grandmother who was a granddaughter of a slave, thus the Eikenbereg Institute is my mother's maiden name. Understanding that Eikenbereg is a very complicated name for a black woman who grew up in South Carolina. And had black friends say to me, why would you want to name the institute this name? It sounds so German, so Jewish, and you think that white folks would give their institutes a name that has such an ethnic overtone to it. So, but it's my mother's maiden name. So I understand the checkered history of that name. I understand how a black woman knows the name Eikenbereg. And my mother's an only child, which is why I want to uplift that in my institute, remind myself, remind us all about how we live with these legacies in our everyday lives, whether we realize it or not. And so, when our contexts are different, our realities are different. And so for my colleague who wants to know about why I was thinking about race is because I've had to think about it since about 4 years old. And the reason why he doesn't think about it is perhaps because he doesn't have to. And the thing about race is that it infiltrates our most intimate experiences. And I think that, forget about race for a moment, I honestly think that for so many families, that every child grows up pedestalizing their parents, even when their parents have not been worthy of being placed on a pedestal. That parents to children pedestalize their parents. And I think we all would agree here, putting race aside for a moment, that one of the most difficult stages in life is when we watch our parents fall awkwardly and without grace in the pedestals upon which we place them. It's hard to get to that phase of life where we see, in a real critical way, their flaws and their imperfections. And yet, for families of color, this developmental process happens so much earlier. So part of the reason why, according to my colleague, I'm obsessed with race is because very early on I saw it. I have vivid memories of being out with my father and watching him at home where he seemed so powerful and so omnipotent and so secure and so self-assured. And I watched him not be able to step out of his Jacksonville, Florida upbringing. And so in front of my very eyes, as his firstborn son who's looking up to him, high on this pedestal, and I watch him become small right in front of my very eyes as he interacted with white men, many white men who were 15, 20 years his junior, who demanded that he call them Mr. while they called him by his first name. I watch him get smaller and smaller in front of my very eyes, to the point where I lost respect for him. And you think about how we don't think about the ways in which race infiltrates families and destroys them. We can talk about how pathological those families of color are, but we don't talk about the sociocultural context that ravages the interior of families of color like an untreated cancer. We don't do that. We look at it void of context. And so there's a way in which, so when my colleague, Guy, says this to me, and I have to admit to you, I used to be the thing that used to just push me beyond my limits was when in a faculty meeting, in a workshop, even in therapy, I would have a white person saying to me, why do you always have to bring up race? And it's even with such disdain, like I'm sitting with scarlet letter. Why do you, and he says that. But now, actually, I've been quite pleased for my colleague, guy to ask me this in faculty meetings, because I've gotten wiser over the years. And now I have an answer that I absolutely love. I even find myself now trying to bait white people into asking me this question. Trying to bait them into asking me, why do you always bring up race? Because my answer is always the same. I looked at my colleague in the faculty meeting and says, I always bring it up because you never do. And I solemnly promise that I'd ever bring it up again if you solemnly promise to bring it up. But what I will not do is sit here while you remain mute on race and attempt to castigate me for bringing it up. So I don't have to bring it up, but you do. Because I understand that why do you bring it up is one of the most powerful silencing tools out there, which is why we didn't end up not talking about race, because when you attempt to talk about race in society, you get silenced, and particularly when you're in a subjugated position. So another part of the socialization process is that, and I'm saying this because I think this carries over, this leaks into our work. And I don't want you to take my word for it. I want you to hold me accountable for everything I'm saying now while my mic is on and your metaphorical mic is not on. So I also think that part of our racial socialization process is that whiteness in our society is at the apex of the apex. That there's nothing that's higher in our society than whiteness. Maybe God, and even some circles that's debated. And that white is considered not only superior, but also is actually a synonym for normal, for human, and also American, are all synonyms for whiteness. And that on the other end of the spectrum, that you have blackness. And there's nothing that's considered worse than blackness. It's at the bottom. The only thing that's worse than blackness is like being a black African American. And what I think, this is the controversial part of my talk, by the way. So the only thing that is worse than being black is to be mistaken as African American, because that's at the bottom of the blackness. So there are actually black people who don't wish to be confused as African American. There are people of color who are reticent to use the term people of color because people of color means black, don't want to be associated with black. And so our whole ideology is that it is more better to be white. And by the way, I fully understand that more better is improper English. I was in Minneapolis giving a talk to Minneapolis Association of Social Workers. I use this term more better, and it's like, I don't know, 500 people there, and at the break, I see this white woman hurriedly coming down the center aisle. And she introduced herself by telling me that she has a bachelor's degree in English. And she noticed I use the term more better. And that more better, she says to me, is improper English. And quite frankly, I think it's inappropriate for a person of your stature to use ebonics. So, I made a pledge to myself that day forward that in her honor, I will continue to use more better. So it's in her honor that I use more better. So we do, and what happens is that all this energy around whiteness, which we all aspire toward, and blackness, which we we repulsed by, creates this racial binary so that if you are biracial, multiracial, Asian, Latina, Latinx, you easily get left out of this discussion because all the energy in this country is on these two places here. But the same dynamics apply to folks in the middle, because here's what I think. I think that, I find it hard to believe that anybody can be born white in this society and not have internalized the notion about white superiority. I don't really care what your other identities are. If you're white, that it's hard to imagine that you're born without incorporating notions about white superiority. Because virtually everything in our society is designed to reinforce that message. Now here, I don't think white people skip around and say, oh, I'm so superior, I'm superior, I'm superior. I don't think it happens that way. I think it's much more subtle. It's much more subtle. It's hard to unpack. It's like a woman said to me just last week in Vermont. Like, yes, I'm in Vermont for some reason. She says to me, white people are oppressed too. And she was superintendent of a school. She said, we're oppressed too. She said, just the other day, I had a white male call me, lamenting the fact that he couldn't get into med school because they prefer to have people of color. So he can't get into med school, and I consider that oppression. Now, it was a fascinating comment because I think embedded in that exchange is this notion about white superiority I'm talking about. Because if we deconstruct, it's because he deserves to be in medical school, and the only way that people of color can get in is because they're people of color. That's what superiority is. It's not where you walk around beating yourself, I'm superior. It's in those subtleties. The subtleties that govern what we do. Now, not only do I believe, and not just because I believe that white people, it's hard for me to imagine white people can be born white and not adhere to these notions of white superiority. I'm not suggesting it's a life sentence that you have to stay there. Because I think it's important to draw a critical distinction between white people, which I think we actually talk, and whiteness. And whiteness is an ideology. It's like democracy. It's like capitalism. And so that for white people, your whiteness, born white, you can't change any more than I can change being born black. So the fact that you're born white is a life sentence. Whether or not you adhere to the principles of whiteness is not a life sentence. That can be a matter of choice to make a point of reality. So not only do I think that white people believe in the superiority of whiteness, but I think that people of color believe in the superiority of whiteness. And why wouldn't people of color? Because our worlds are inundated with whiteness. And again, I don't think people of color walk around saying, oh, white people are so superior and I'm inferior. It doesn't happen that way. Much more subtle. It's where people of color have difficulty embracing anything that white people reject. So I'm out in San Francisco meeting with a group of executives and doing a 4-day intensive training. And I'm walking up to the training, and there's an elaborate breakfast outside. And I just happened to notice this one person, a black male, who was meticulously taking his fruit out of the fruit bowl. And I was struck by it because he was so incredibly meticulous. And it caught my attention. So we get into the meeting, and as a way of just sort of connecting with him, I said, you know, I feel like I already know you. I watched you getting your breakfast this morning, and you have refined getting your breakfast to a fine art. I've never seen anyone who's so careful in getting your breakfast. And it was like watching like a ballerina, I said to him. I'm just trying to connect. So there was a protracted silence. He stopped. And he looked at me, and he said, yeah, I have to be honest with you. I was trying not to get watermelon. So it's funny to me how a number of you already knew this story before I even finished it. I was not trying to get watermelon. So I knew why, but again, remember, if we want to promote conversations about race, curiosity, meaning, and motivation, So I said, why? What does that mean? He said, I don't eat watermelon in front of white people. Now, just to give you a piece of context, not that it should matter, but just to add it, because this person is like second in command of an 11,000 member organization, super well educated. My point in raising that is to say this isn't a matter of education or social standing. It's a matter of racial socialization and what gets internalized and how hard it is to expunge what's been internalized. And not so much because of the human frailties of people of color, but often because there's no context to unpack this stuff. And the places that should be, like therapy and with your social worker, are usually places where it can't happen either. Because quite frankly, we don't get a lot of this training how to deal with these issues in the context of most curricula. At best, we get how to, it's rather superficial. It doesn't get into the meat of this matter. And so he went on to say that as a dark-skinned person who had grown up in Birmingham, Alabama, that anytime he eats watermelon in front of white people, that what he imagined is that they see this hyper-blackened caricature that so many of us grew up watching, that led us to feel badly about ourselves. And some of us in the room watched it and never thought twice about it. He said, so what I see is this black caricature with these super large lips and a big slice of watermelon devoured. And I imagine that's how white people are looking at me. And so I just don't do it. So what I'm suggesting is this internalization around one's inferiority is not where we're consciously saying, oh, I'm inferior, but it plays out in ways that we find it hard to embrace that which white people and whiteness rejects. Now, I also think that there are two places where our racial socialization process allows whites and people of color to have a rather harmonious relationship. One is that we're socialized to not talk about race. And so the problem it creates is that because we're socialized not to talk about race, we tend not to talk about race. And because we tend not to talk about race, we don't know how to talk about race. And in fact, we don't know how to talk about race because we don't talk about race. And we don't talk about race because it's easy. So we're caught in this vicious cycle. And it doesn't really matter whether we're talking about colleague to colleague, because what I maintain is that most institutions that like in universities, the faculty of color and white faculty, if we could really be brutally honest, have a very polite professional relationship that's fake. Because and you're laughing and crying. Yeah. Because what happens is that most universities, though a bastion of liberalism, both social work programs, psychology programs, bastion of liberalism, but the rules of race are still very much in place. And so the faculty of color understand, because of this process, that's an artifact of white ideology in the first place, we call promotion and tenure, that basically are tools that silence faculty of color, and that you can't speak about yourself openly and candidly without being considered. It's like my colleague Guy says to me, you're always talking about race, and then in our last faculty meeting, he actually said, I'm sick and tired in this faculty. No matter what I do, I'm always going to be looked at as a privileged white male. And I said, because I'm not interested anymore of muting my voice. I spent the early part of my life doing that. And if you look at health disparities, the reason why people of color die sooner and have all sorts of diseases is because what goes in and has to be secret, has to be cloaked in silence, becomes symptomatic. And so we want to keep pushing drugs and pills and and not deal with the sociocultural conditions that actually feed those illnesses. So my response to my brother Guy is that you continue to be treated like a privileged white male because you continue to show up in faculty meetings as one. And so when you say things like, excuse me for interrupting, I don't mean to interrupt, it's still an interruption. And when I see you doing that repetitively with women and faculty of color, it's like that this urgency to what you have to say has to be said now, I can't wait, even when I'm talking. I want you to think about what is it positions you to think that somehow that you have to finish my comments. Or even if you're polite and saying, oh, excuse me, I don't mean to interrupt, it's still a freaking interruption, right? So there's a way in which then that we collude around this silence around race, around people of color and whites. And so we keep it polite, we keep it light. And so we've learned how to go along to get along, and yet it's to our detriment. It's to our detriment. And the final thing about a racial socialization is that that I believe that the place where there's perfect harmony between, and we just wanted to think about this, around this thing about talking. So it's amazing to me that how people of color, and I submit to you, it'll happen during our Q&A answer period. I promise you this will happen. So people of color become so adept at talking about race in front of white people and using codes. So I'm always amused when I'm in a workshop like this, and a person of color will say, well, people from the dominant group, meaning white, other cultures, meaning white, other ethnicities, meaning white, some people, meaning white, that it's almost as if it's like we've been, and again, I don't mean it's humorous, I think it's in our DNA, it comes from a place of fear. That is what happens for a group that's been terrorized. So even when I'm so made, I see this in my own family. This past weekend, I was with my family celebrating my aunt's birthday, and my aunt's saying, we're a group at the table, she's talking, and then she says, which is familiar to me, and said, and was she white? Why are you whispering? I don't know. A few minutes later, she, oh yeah, I was whispering. A few minutes later, did the exact same thing. So people come. It is rare. It takes a progressive white person to really refer to themselves, each other as white. It almost never happens. White people just don't refer to whiteness. They don't. So then we just don't talk about it. We talk around. We dance around it. And the other thing is that so what happens is that we have this way in which we're on eggshells around race. We're on eggshells around race, so we don't really fully engage around it. And so the final point I want to make here is that I also think that another place where we're perfectly suited for each other around socialization processes that people of color, I think, are socialized to take care of white people. And white people are socialized to have people go to take care. So it's a perfect complementary relationship. So when you think about who are typically the sweepers of the streets, the cleaners of this building, those who clean the toilets and drive the cabs and keep America clean, is usually people of color, but they're part of that invisible workforce we don't see during the day, they come out at night. And in contexts like this, the caretaking isn't around manual labor, it's around emotionally caretaking white people. So we have this inability to speak our truth in the presence of white people if it makes white people uncomfortable. And again, I understand why that is. It's in the DNA. It's fearful. It creates fear. And if I do a workshop like this, and I know that if there's a person of color, doesn't matter, Asian, Latinx, Black, who speaks up and speaks very forcefully about their experience that implicates white people, I just step back here and I just wait because I know what's going to happen. At some point, there's going to be a person of color it's not a white person who's going to take that person on. It's going to be a person of color who takes that person on. So, well, it's like I have a black colleague at Drexel, and whenever I speak directly about race, she typically comes up and says, well, I'm a black woman, I grew up in Mississippi, and I never experienced a day of racism in my life. And I started Googling for Prozac, looking for it. I needed dose at that point. But I understand what happens is that there's some discomfort that gets created because we have difficulty really discussing race. So I think that if we're going to talk about race in our practices, in our practical sites, in the classroom, with colleagues, that we have to develop the muscles to do that because we're not trained, we're not socialized to have cross-racial, like, we're just in this fairly radical right now, having a room that's racially mixed and actually having an open conversation about race. This is rare for our society. We talk in racial pockets, but not with each other. So we don't even know how to do it. So I do think that there are 5 critical relationship factors that we have to develop in order to be able to position ourselves to have conversations about race. So when I'm training clinicians, I'm actually trying to help develop their muscles for this because it's what needs to happen in order for them to be able to have conversations about race. So I'll just go through these very quickly. So one is that it requires intensity. And intensity is stretching beyond our comfort zone. So if you're uncomfortable with intensity, then it's hard to have a meaningful conversation about race because race is one of those subjects that what happens in our society, either it becomes quickly shut down or quickly escalates. There's no middle territory. And so the intensity is about how do we stay in that place of discomfort. What typically happens is when racial conversations get intense, if it's cross-racial, then what happens is that white people tend to say, I don't feel safe. Because, and there's nothing that actually halts a conversation about race as rapidly as a white woman who doesn't feel safe. End of conversation. It doesn't happen. If the woman of color doesn't feel safe, kidneys hanging out, eyeball dangling, oh, you're strong, you can deal with it. So there's a difference in how we handle it. I'm going to ask if we go to Q&A, why are you covering your mouth? Yeah.
I want to laugh and cry. Right?
Yeah.
With this and
Yeah. Maybe. So I think this inability to manage intensity, and what happens, there's a conflation of safety and comfort. That everyone in this room, unquestionably, irrefutably, 100% definitively, is required and is deserving of safety. We all deserve to be safe. And yet, no one deserves to be comfortable, necessarily. Comfort is not a right. And so, I make every effort to make sure my classrooms are not comfortable, that my supervision processes are not comfortable. It's my job to ensure safety, but not my job to guarantee comfort. And we can't have meaningful conversations about race when we're committed to comfort. And so, how do I hold myself accountable? I always ask myself, and for trainees as well, for students, it's what I'm hoping you'll do here in this Q&A, which we will get to very quickly. Do I hold myself accountable to ask that one question more that I'm comfortable asking? Do I make one statement more that I'm comfortable making? Or do I simply do what I always do? Because when we do what we always do, we end up doing what we always do. And we do what we always do, we just do what we always do. And what we always do, it ain't good enough. So there's also intimacy. And intimacy is about one's ability to be vulnerable. Now, obviously, the most ideal situation in racial conversation is to, as intensity increases, increase intimacy. That is usually not what happens. Because actually, when you increase intimacy, you de facto increase intensity. So if someone started crying here in the room, vulnerably, what happens, the intensity of the room goes up because we relate to that. But you can increase intensity without increasing intimacy, which is about vulnerability. More often than not, when conversations of race go awry, it's because intensity's increased and intimacy hasn't. There's been no effective change in intimacy. This also requires, so intimacy, intensity, also congruency. And congruency is that what I'm thinking, what I'm saying, and what I'm exhibiting are perfectly synced together. And so too often around conversations about race, we say one thing and our body's expressing something else. And I know for people of color whose antennae are tuned in to pick up incongruities because your life depends on it, that becomes a conversation stopper, right there, the incongruity. And so there's also transparency, and transparency is this willingness to be seen, to really show myself. And I just think the more privilege we hold in society, the less easy it is to be transparent. I think men have trouble with transparency because when you're programmed as a superior gender, it's kind of hard to show your vulnerabilities. I had an experience not long ago. My nephew was killed in a car accident while home on his college break, and played JV basketball. We went to school. He was killed by a drunken driver. And so I show up at this funeral, and I was momentarily distracted by what I saw. So all his college teammates, my brothers, occupied the first two rows, and every single male had on sunglasses. I think it's that you attend a funeral and you come prepared to cry by hiding. That's the difficulty that one has with vulnerability when one is packaged as the superior one. You can't show emotion. So oftentimes the conversation about race is very difficult for many white people to be transparent. When asked a question like, what was the racial epithet that you heard in the family you grew up in? Knowing that it's commonplace for that to happen in virtually all families. It's very difficult to own that. And so if you can't own that, you can't move on from it. So intimacy, intensity, congruency, transparency, and the final one is authenticity. And authenticity is, do I say what I mean and mean what I say? Because there is a distinction to be made between racial awareness and racial sensitivity. Racial awareness is what I think. Racial awareness is what I get from reading a book. Racial awareness is what the notes I take from my college lecture. That feeds my head. Sensitivity is what I feel here. It's when I begin to anticipate other. Whereas racial awareness shapes what you think, sensitivity shapes what you do. And so it's possible to be very racially aware and racially insensitive. And this is a challenge for many white people, which is when that, and all of us really, because when given a choice to deal with race directly, given an option to spectate or participate, those who have privilege, white people tend to spectate rather than participate. And I think it's important to be able to participate. So let me stop here and take your questions, your comments, your pros and cons, your petite annoyances, agitations. And thank you. Thank you very much. Yes.
I had two situations. One happened a couple of years ago, and one happened today. I'm over here. I work in a small office, and a couple of years ago, I usually bring my breakfast, and I was heating it in the toaster oven. One of my white colleagues peeked in the oven, in the kitchen, and she said, "Oh, Carolyn, is that your pork chop in there?" And I didn't react right away. I went back to my seat, and I think I stayed there for about a minute. And then I got out of my seat and I confronted her.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, "Why would you say that? That was a very racist statement to make."
Mm-hmm.
And she said, well, I didn't, she became very defensive. And I said, "Why are you looking in on my food anyway?
Mm-hmm.
And second of all, it's not pork chop."
Mm-hmm.
So she said, well, I like pork chops too, you know. So I said, look, don't make those statements. Don't try to identify my food. Don't make any comments. If you like the way it smells, just say you like the way it smells. So my African-American colleagues started teasing me. Every time I cooked something, they would say, what you got, pork chops? So I was explaining to my son, who's from a different generation, and he said, Mom, I think you were being a bit of a bully. And I said, I don't think I was. So a couple of years ago, I attended a workshop here in this very room on race and race relations. And one of the things that I learned I could do is maybe take some of the bass out of my voice and, you know, not be so angry acting, but I was angry. It really ticked me off that she would make those kind of assumptions. So today, coming here on the elevator, not the, at the parking lot, I got on the elevator. Just before me, it was a young black man got on the elevator. Then I got on, and then an elderly white man got on. And so the young black man said to me, what floor? And I said, the 4th floor, please. I was going back up to my car. And he said, okay, so he pressed it, and I said, thank you. So he asked the elderly white gentleman, what floor? He said, the 10th floor. And that's it. So I said in a very calm, nice voice, he did something nice for you. You were not very polite. You could have said thank you. And he said, my bad. You're right. So I felt that I had approached it a little different. I wasn't, like I said, took the bass out my voice. But as I was explaining to my son, one of the things that I think you have to do is if you see something that's inappropriate, I don't want people to keep saying the same things over or similar. I thought that was a very racist statement. And I did approach her later and say, well, one of the things that I'm learning is I can approach it without being so angry about it, you know, and kind of just have a civil conversation so that you don't keep doing those kind of things that are offensive. And this is a person who thinks she's very liberal. And I think sometimes people think in their minds they're more liberal, but they can be very insensitive about things that they say. And I feel like I should say something if it's offensive to me, just like I would want that person to say something. So that's just it. I felt a little better today.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Because I appreciate it, because I think we all should ideally exercise the PSA rule. You know, when you see something, say something. Because, like, to not say anything, then you just carry it around with you. But it's also an opportunity for engagement. And as you were suggesting, I don't think we have to behead the other person, because I think that these issues that we all get, part of the reason why I took so much time to talking about the racial socialization process is because many of these ideas and perceptions get embedded early on in life. And even though we grow, some of them remain until we engage around them. And so that's why it's possible, and I don't give myself a pass on it, that I can, my mouth can still say things and my ears are shocked that I've said, even while I'm holding myself out as Mr. Cultural Diversity. Yeah. Yes. Yes.
So I have a question. I'm a therapist on campus, and I work in a clinic where, like you said, I'm the only black clinician, except our front desk staff is all black, and then our cleaning staff is all black. And in my situation, I could rant and rave about race in every meeting, and everybody would let me talk forever. Everybody would nod their head and support me. But I still think there's limitations in how they're acting in it. And so sort of like the opposite of what you were describing, where you're shut down and the room shuts down. I could go on forever and everyone would nod and send me emails and congratulations for talking about it and everything, but then I still feel like they're limited in understanding or seeing what the challenges are. So approaching that other side of it, over like sort of like white guilt versus superiority, because that's what the room feels like, is I get all the white guilt, and it has its benefits, but also has its limitations.
And what do you do with the white guilt?
I take over. I talk in a lot of meetings. It comes up in every meeting.
You take care of it.
Oh, okay.
No, man. I mean.
Maybe no. Yes, like word. Like yes.
See, because I think that institutionally, when so we even have a situation where the people of color are on eggshells, where we can't talk openly about what we truly think and feel, And so there, on the surface, there's a good working relationship, it's a compatible relationship. Because, like, what I think is that for many institutions, this one being the exception, of course, it's like they, seek out those qualified minorities. And when they're successful in securing and hiring those qualified minorities, then once those qualified minorities are in place, they're then subjected to a powerful, unacknowledged homogenization process. And the thing about homogenization is great for milk, maybe, but it's terrible for people. And so what happens, oftentimes you have people of color in institutions who have to become, by virtue of the dynamics, what I say refer to as a gem. G-E-M-M is a metaphor for good, effective, mainstream minority. And there are rules of engagement for gems. So around not talking about race, or if you talk about it, there's a way to talk about it. If white people feel guilty or feel hurt or feel anger or misunderstood, then you take care of it. And the perfect marriage institutionally is between the gem, the good, effective, mainstream minority, and the good white person. They make for a very happy marriage institutionally. So my thought would be, I wonder what would, you don't have to answer this, but I wonder what would happen if the place where the conversation stops would actually be where it started. Where you went back to your colleague and say, I appreciate the fact that I'm able, as a person of color, to have the freedom here to say whatever I want to say about race. And I've noticed that while the space is granted and there's acknowledgement interpersonally, if nothing changes and there's no depth to our conversation, it makes me wonder what that's about. See, I think leaning into the conversation. Because you talking about it and them saying, yes, that's a great point, is not really a conversation. Okay. Are there other questions? Yes?
So the point that you made near the end of what you were saying about white people needing to participate rather than just spectate, I know how that's important in outside of black spaces. I know how that's important outside of spaces that are for people of color. But in those spaces, I learned that it's not our space to take up. It's not for us. So we can listen if we want, sure, but just support, take it in. But it's not our place to add anything or any of that. It's not for us, and that's not a bad thing at all.
And why do you feel that way? I mean, what's behind your thinking?
Because there are so many spaces that we have as white people where we can express whatever it is that we're thinking, and we're safe to do that. Whereas there are considerably fewer spaces for people of color and black people to do that.
See, I think about it differently because even in spaces with people of color, me personally, and this may not, obviously it's in disagreement with what you believe and others here. I don't actually even want white people spectating in those situations, but see, it's about how you participate. Like, it's about if you're willing to unpack your whiteness in that space. And so when people of color are talking about, some struggle they've had with having their voice, like it'd be useful to me to have you in that space think about where are the times, where are the places where your whiteness has spilled over and actually created the support of a situation like that. It's like, what I don't think is useful is having a white person in those spaces be the expert on people of color. I think if you're being the expert in your own whiteness and you're engaging in conversation that's intimate and transparent and where you're owning your stuff, then that's a different level of contribution. But oftentimes that's not, from my experience, not the level of participation that many whites are actually thinking about. Does that make sense? I'm not asking if you agree, but does that make sense to you?
No, it does. I agree. I think I'm thinking of a very particular space, and that's why I'm sort of in a different direction.
Well, because I just think it's important for, I think it's important for white people to show up in spaces as white people, not as experts, not as your subjugated self. And because the thing about it, when we have these conversations, usually it creates a dynamic where you have people of color who are highly emotive because it taps into some preexisting pain and trauma around this stuff. And then white people observing, or telling the person of color how courageous they are, or how they relate to what you're saying. But I don't see white people oftentimes struggling with what are the ways in which I'm complicit with this system that has been injurious to your soul. Well, to me, that's a different level of cooperation. To engage in the process of self-interrogation and then to be able to share that doesn't happen nearly as frequently as I think it should or could, or would be helpful for that matter. Yes?
A work environment. I'm in a work environment where I feel that there's so much cultural diversity that in that environment we're told to be tolerant. The discussion of race never comes up. And then when it does, it's always as though there's some negativity to it. She must be the angry black woman, you know. And I think it's difficult when you're a social worker and you've got to deal with various different cultures and practice, but also in the working environment. It's just not easy.
Yeah, and that's part of like the mutism that happens. And if I had, one time I talk about, because I spent some time thinking through what is it that white people need to do in order to be able to participate in these conversations, and what is it people calling to bring to it? Because there's a way in which we collude to keep the process stuck in the way it's stuck. So one piece of advice, and you didn't ask for it, and you can certainly free to reject it, but I'm often giving people of color this advice in therapy and classroom and supervision that I really wish we would get over. And I'm not naive when I say this, I do understand how it comes to be. But to get over this notion of trying to dispel the idea that I'm an angry black person, for example. So when people refer to me in like workshops, which I have, which I appreciate, as an angry black male, I say you have 2 to 3 right. Male I am, black I am. But it's not anger, it's rage. And rage is what you have when something has happened to you. So rage is a response to trauma. And so you're reading the trauma-informed material that says, well, when you become trauma-informed, it changes the types of questions that you ask in the process. You go from a mindset that says, what's wrong with you, to what happened to you. And that changes the interactions. Well, I'm trying to do that same thing with people of color to say, because it is crazy making to be thrust in a situation that is rage-inducing, and then to say, don't be angry. And then we're trying to do this crazy thing, like my insides is ablaze, but I'm trying to be angry. I mean, no. I think it's to recognize there's a distinction between anger and rage, and that as long as the conditions out there are those that nurture and precipitate rage, it's appropriate to have it. And so I'm telling young kids I work with, it's not because they're young black and brown kids who are often sent to anger management, which doesn't do squat for rage, because it's good for anger, it's not good for rage. And rage is about having been in experiences where you have experienced firsthand, over and over and over again, marginalization, degradation, domination. And I don't care who you are. I mean, it's like that you see sometimes that heterosexual woman is in a heterosexual relationship, has been abused by the husband, at some point propels her to murder him. And that's driven by rage. It's driven about being perpetually and systematically degraded. And so my hope is for our own liberation, that we'll be able to own the fact that we have enrage and look for opportunities for outrage, because it has to be channeled. Because I fully understand this microphone is my Uzi. Yes.
I'd like to hear your thoughts on what white social workers can do to use these skills to move the conversation forward in the clinical setting. So let's say it isn't something where people are being called the N-word or the S-word, but you have you have a black client or a client of color, and they want to use these principles to move the conversation forward.
Well, you see, great question. And I think, first of all, we have to change some of, it requires a little bit of a paradigmatic shift around helping relationships. So, first and foremost, if we're still operating from the assumption that all self-disclosure is bad, that conversation is going to be much harder to have. So, I think having that therapist use themselves. So I highly recommend the white therapist, all therapists, but the white therapist, pursuant to your question, to locate themselves in that process. So it's like the white therapist is saying, as a white, it's preferably what she or he says by saying as a white therapist. Now, I was in Nashville, Tennessee, made this very point, and it was a psychiatrist who, upon hearing that, stood up and started, he was, speaking of rage, he was furious with me. He said, that is the dumbest thing I've heard from a so-called educated person my entire life. Why the hell would I have to say I'm white? It's obvious I'm white. And I was thinking, yeah, dude, you're a psychiatrist. Like, you know, you have the power to write yourself. But he was furious. And so what I said to him was, I could see how, on the surface, that would seem problematic. Because, yes, you know you're white, and I know you're white. But if I'm your client, I need to know that you know you're white. And that's the purpose of saying, as a white therapist. So, as a white social worker, if I enter that into the discourse, it's multifaceted. One is, it's showing some sense of self-awareness on behalf of that white social worker, because I think that sometimes the privilege of being white is that you don't always know you're white. You don't have to know you're white. So the white social workers are just as a social worker, as a human being. But that client of color is seeing them through a racial lens. Secondly, if the therapist, no matter who it is, the social worker, locates themselves, then it's a way of the person who has the power serving as a broker of permission. Because here's what I believe. I believe that we operate in society under a gag order around race. You don't need me to come here today and say we don't talk about it. We know not to talk about it in a way that's meaningful, honest, and pure. We just don't. And so why wouldn't the same rules of engagement be replete throughout the helping relationship? They do. They carry to all those other relationships. So unless the person with power, the social worker, is dealing with that issue overtly and granting permission for those conversations, and I don't mean I give you permission to talk about it, permission to use of self. And it's not like a chess game. It's not like I say, as a white social worker, and then, okay, and I say, okay, now identify yourself. It's not that way. It's seamlessly integrated into the process where if I bring it up enough, that what happens is there's something permission giving about my bringing it up that creates a space for that conversation to be facilitated. Does that make sense? Yes.
In the situation you were describing in the very beginning, where you were observing the family therapy, and the racist comment came up, how would a clinician decide on how to continue? Because both the family's problems are important, but the comment that the father made is also very important. So.
Yeah, and I appreciate the question. So here's my thought about it. So first, I go for the assumption that race, and I would say the same thing is true for gender and sexual orientation, just focusing on race because that's what we're going to talk about today, is almost always either connected to the presenting problem or the therapeutic process. When it's connected either place, I think that warrants leaning into the conversation. So in this particular situation, that I think because the father that was like his initial introduction to that process, that the therapist then, she wasn't sure what to do with it. I encouraged her to at least pursue that. Now, and at some point when we were able to get the conversation out of this toxic place around race to him feeling like he had been wronged, and so therefore that gave him permission to be verbally aggressive and dismissive. Our next question was, has the family experienced him this way in other situations? And the wife was the first to jump in and say, yes, that he often gets that way with me. He's not calling her names, but often expresses his anger through name calling and punching, metaphorically punching. You know, if you're having trouble with the conceptualization, just think nationally about name calling and punching back, you know. So that was seamlessly integrated into the process. Now, I remember being in Boston and doing, it's always interesting terminology. I was giving it like a lecture like this, and then in the afternoon there was a live therapy session, which is always an interesting term, live as opposed to dead. And I remember bringing up race in the section where race had not been indicated. And there was a physician, another psychiatrist by the way, who was rather agitated because he said that I hope you know, sir, that was your issue that you brought it up. And I readily conceded the point. He was absolutely right. The fact that I brought it up was my issue. And I said to him, I'm inferring from your questions that had you been the therapist, you would not have brought it up. And that, sir, is your issue. So it's not like I just have issues, but there's a way in which I think it's problematic if we pursue that and we get stuck on that issue. But because it's offered, my thing is always lenient. I had a client in my own office in New York. You know, I go out first session. I get to the waiting room. He says, thank God you're not one of those Jewish doctors. And so I had this massive debate with my colleagues because they said, you let it go, you wait until, if you pursue it, wait until you have a relationship. And my question is why? Because if upon seeing me, that he drops out of my lap. So I don't have to say, you anti-Semitic schmuck. I don't have to say that. I said to him, how do you know? Because that comment was a loaded comment. It wasn't just an anti-Jewish sentiment he was expressing, but also race was embedded in that. Like, why do you think he thought I wasn't Jewish? Had it been white, he wouldn't have said, oh, thank God you're not one of those Jewish doctors. So we got him off, we sat down, I asked him about it, and again, it was not unlike Mr. Peterson. He had a negative experience with a Jew, and now walks around with this animus toward all Jews. But we didn't get stuck there. And there are places in the therapy where I've been able to come back to that, not so much about his anti-Semitism, but about the rapidity with which he judges and he draws conclusions, and that was germane to therapy. Does that make sense? Before we run out of time, this would just make my day, and I need to know that I'm loved.
You are.
And so, what would allow me to feel loved would be that if one or two of you who felt some angst or have some issue with what I've said, if you would just share it with me, give it back to me, because I always worry that, like if you're like slightly pissed off with me or agitated, you'll go and take it on your pet or your partner. But also, it would be good practice. I mean, I don't need to defend what I said, but I would want to know what didn't land in your lap as gracefully as I would have hoped it would have. Anybody? Please. Yes.
So you made a half, I think, joking comment that our school is excluded. And that made me think, we're really trying to do some work here. We're not excluded. And I don't want you to think that we're in such a great place either. We're doing a lot of work.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. There was another hand. Yes.
I think I heard multiple comments and jokes or references to Prozac or mental health medications and prescriptions, and that landed not so gracefully with me. I think in a profession where we work so hard to end mental health stigma, that taking medicine shouldn't be a joke, and that if someone disagrees with you, that shouldn't be a reason for them to be medicated. And that's what that sounded like to me, and that was swimming in my head at the time.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And just to clarify, the medication would have been for me, but it doesn't change the point you're making. I think it's a point well taken. And thank you. Anyone else? Yes.
You were talking about emotional labor and Black people and people of color being placed as the caretaker. all of this emotional labor on Black people and on Black women especially. Go feel joy. Go live your life. Why do you have to take care of us? Why do you have to fix us?
You had a response? You had a response. You someone. Right. See, because I think it's embedded in a larger power dynamic, you know, where it's a false choice. It's like, I'm going to, later today, I'm going to take a flight, and I know what's going to happen. I'm going to go through security. And it doesn't matter how nice that person is. It says, can you spread your legs? Now I want to touch you all up your thighs and around your junk. Is that okay? And so I know if I want to get through and fly, I'd say, yes, it's okay. But it would be great to be able to say, no, it's not okay, and still fly. And so I think that's part of the dynamic. Anyone else? Please, last one. No one?
Well, you may not want this feedback, but I'm really, to me, I haven't found anything you said really offensive or anything. I appreciate your openness and all. I'm just reflecting on, like, how can I have more meaningful conversations? You know, I work at a very upscale country club, which is private, but dominantly white male. Particularly, I don't like that. I really don't. Our chef, 5-star chef, is Black. And I thought, I've never seen a Black chef. Not that I don't think a Black man can't be a chef, but I would love to sit down with him and have an honest conversation about his life and how he got to his position and all that. But I feel like even if I try to start that conversation in a respectful way, it will come across very racially inappropriate. Even having a very honest, respectful conversation, and our janitor, she's a white woman. I mean, not all of the stereotypes, you know, fit. And I've tried to have some meaningful conversations in different areas and have been rebuffed. But it's with honesty and interest. So I'm just thinking, I guess I wanted to share some of those are my experiences. And I think as, you know, with the political season and all, and I'm maybe becoming more politically astute as I get older, I look at Congress, it's like, this is not representative of America, having more than half of Congress white, whether, you know, white male. You know, where are the women? Where are the different cultures? Where are, just to make America more representative of who we are?
You see, I appreciate everything you said, and I think, I believe about your questions, because here's my thought. I think it's terrific that you see what you see. I started earlier by talking about seeing through the prism of race. And I think it's absolutely fantastic that that you care enough about this Black chef, you want to have a conversation with him. But I think the conversation you have to have first is with all the white people there. Because see, that's a much more difficult conversation. Like, hey, have you all noticed what I noticed? We're really white here. And how do we come to it? Does this bother anybody else? To me? Because I guarantee you that will be a much more difficult conversation to have than talking to the chef. Because the chef has been socialized by how to talk to you. But I have a colleague out in Oakland who says, he always says to me, Black man, 71 years old, he says, I'm finished talking to white people about race. He said, you know, you can be the white people doctor all you want. I said, I fully embrace it. He said, because I think white people need to talk to white people so they can see just how hard it is to talk about race to white people. So I think that conversation to have with all your white colleagues there about how do they get to be so white, why is it still white?
And like, how do they perceive the people who are of different colors in different positions of authority or not, or?
Not even that conversation. I thought I heard you say the place is predominantly white.
For the membership, yes.
Right. So I'm saying talk with the white people there about why is it predominantly white, or why is it all white? How did they get to be there? What is it they think maintains it? Does I'm you. It bothers me. Does it bother you? Like it bothers? How come it
Do
doesn't
you even
bother
have a
you?
reaction to it?
Yes.
Awareness.
That would be a much more difficult conversation to have, and I think that would be the conversation I would recommend that precedes the conversation with the chef. Look, I am out of time. I have 2 phones here and a clock here. It doesn't matter which one I use, I'm out of time. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
poetry, like a poetry slam on top of church. People living